Back now with the panel, former Homeland Security Chief Jeh Johnson, Daniel Pletka of the American Enterprise Institute, NBC Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent Andrea Mitchell, and former NBC News White House Senior Producer and current Washington Bureau Chief of Vice News, Shana Thomas. Before we get to politics, Congress is coming back, the gun issue. Jeh Johnson, you've dealt with the gun issue in different ways as Department of Homeland Security. You know the politics of this town. 51 people died in the month of August. On the very last day of the month, we get that reminder in case anybody was letting El Paso and Dayton fade.
Chuck, to me, it feels like this time it might be different. I feel as though, my sense is that public opinion and congressional opinion are moving in the direction of doing some things consistent with the Second Amendment. This is a uniquely American problem, and it requires a national solution. And particularly now that we're back in an election cycle, Republicans, it seems to me, are going to want to be able to be in a position to say they have done something on this. And the timing of this latest tragedy, just as Congress is coming back into town, suggests also there'll be a certain amount of momentum this time. And so my hope is that we'll finally get something done on this issue.
Danny, what's your sense?
My sense is that that's a triumph of hope over experience. I think that actually the opposite of what you suggest is happening. I think that the more we see this, the more casualties there are, the more gun violence there is, the more numb people are, and the less response we're going to get. It's to me, it's like terrorism in a way. You know, people get used to it, and that's what you don't want. But I'm afraid that that's what's going to dictate what Congress does.
The only glimmer of hope I had this week was talking to Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut, Newtown, and of course a really important advocate. He said he's been meeting throughout this recess since El Paso and Dayton, of course. He's been meeting with White House staff. He's been meeting with top people. He's talked to the president several times. So maybe there is some give because of the politics of it, the political season. And 90% approval in many polls for background checks, for closing the gun show loopholes. But then, as Garrett Hake, our correspondent in Odessa, was saying this today, September 1st, Texas laws are changing so that you can bring guns into churches or, you know, the open carry into schools. So there are so many political and cultural arguments in Danny's favor.
Shana, you're a native Texan. You've seen this. Do you buy the idea that, to me, if Texas changes the conversation, then all of a sudden America will?
Yes, and we're seeing sort of Governor Greg Abbott kind of struggle with how do you change this conversation or how do you make that work. But as you said, laws went into effect, and the school one has to do with guns being able to be kept in your car on school property. That is something that the Texas legislature has already passed. That is going into effect today. That's interesting. I think the other thing is, you see the political campaign as something that may encourage people to do something. I see the political campaign as something that will discourage Republicans from doing anything. That because there is so much focus on this and it's an election cycle, that people are going to get scared, they're going to go to their base, and I'm not sure that means something is actually going to happen in the next couple of months.
Look, timing is everything. The legislative session in Florida was actually in session after Parkland, which is why the pressure was able to happen. Had it not been in session, who knows what would have happened.
And the kids went to Tallahassee right away.
You don't know with them coming back immediately, does this have a little bit of that?
Yeah, if we see people marching in the streets in Washington, D.C. when the Senate is back and the House is back, maybe something on red flag laws or background checks happen. But I'm not seeing anyone rallying people like that.
Let me pivot to this discussion of Joe Biden. Gaffes versus lies, I guess is one way to put it. And do the gaffes matter? The Washington Post had dueling columns. I got to put these up because it was interesting. Dana Milbank essentially making the case that the gaffes do matter. Joe Biden isn't a gaffe machine. He's the Lamborghini of gaffes. Meanwhile, Paul Waldman saying lay off of Joe Biden's gaffes. But you know, Andrea Mitchell, Peter Hamby at Vanity Fair wrote about why these gaffes can be damaging to Biden. For Biden, being gaffe-prone puts him exactly on the wrong side of the media's incentive structure in the Twitter age, even when there are much more important things happening in the world, and that's just where Trump wants his strongest rival to be. Do you buy that?
In part, but what the Biden people are saying is, look, what is getting through to the people is that this is a guy who cares. He cares about that soldier who didn't want to take the medal. And yes, he conflated 3 different stories, and the Washington Post pointed out in how many ways he got things wrong. But that does not matter to the voters. Now, we don't know yet how this is going to play. Certainly the polls so far, and it is the summer and people are perhaps not paying attention, are not focusing on these things as much as we in the media or other people in the media maybe. The fact is that Donald Trump, as someone who misspeaks constantly, deliberately, through lack of knowledge, through lies, other kinds of problems, is the standard that whoever is the Democratic nominee is going to run against. What Biden has to be concerned about, of course, is getting the nomination. And again, the Biden folks will say, you're not looking at these other candidates who are making mistakes on the trail. And we say, show us where that's
probably a fair point. Jay Johnson, this does seem to be a problem for Biden, to me, more of a primary than a general. The comparison, Trump to me is a shield for him on this stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
I'd give Joe a break. Joe's a storyteller. He makes his points through anecdotes, through stories, and is probably thinking, let's not get the small details in the way of a very powerful story. And so I'd give him a break on this. And apparently the person on whom he pinned the medal acknowledged that he actually got the medal. So the point he's trying to make is not self-aggrandizement. It's simply to demonstrate the heroism of the men and women in our U.S. military, which is a totally valid point. Anybody here remember Martin Treptow? Martin Treptow was Reagan's closer in his first inaugural address, one of the best inaugural addresses in modern history. And he closed with the story of a World War I hero named Martin Treptow. Though nothing he said in the address was technically wrong, he conveyed the impression that he was buried at Arlington, but he was actually buried in Wisconsin. So, but the larger point still stands about American heroism in a time of war. And I think, this kind of thing, particularly compared to the current incumbent in the White House, should not, be a big problem for him.
Danny, it's an interesting comparison because there is a part of Biden that feels more Reagan-esque that way. You're like, it's Grandpa, it's Uncle Joe, whatever that is. Let the old man do it.
Okay, first of all, I think it's important to emphasize that all of us who have known Joe Biden for a really long time know that this is not a product of old age.
Right.
This is a Joe Biden hallmark.
It's a Joe.
That's number one. Number two, I don't agree that Donald Trump is a shield. The president is a liar, and I am too. Who cares? Does that fit on a bumper sticker? I mean, it doesn't work. I think people are looking for a relief from Donald Trump, not somebody who is slightly better than Donald Trump. I also think that his age is an issue, not because I have any prejudice against older people, God knows, as I get older, but because I think that this is where the energy of young people is going to matter.
Shauna, why do you think the Democratic Party has been turned, that the youngest supporters seem to gravitate to the oldest candidates?
Well, I think it's because, Julian Castro said it. He talked about how Democrats have tried to nominate risks. He mentioned JFK, he mentioned Barack Obama. But that means he's saying he himself is a bit of a risk.
I thought that was interesting too,
Which is interesting. And the thing you hear from people on the campaign trail, all of our teams at Vice News here, is all they want is somebody who can beat Donald Trump. And they don't really care if that person is young or old yet. Now, that may all shift as we sort of condense the group, but that is what they're hearing. I also think when it comes to Joe Biden, the Uncle Joe situation, it's interesting because we are living in the age of Donald Trump, and that changes how we perceive and cover Joe Biden. But we have to cover it with context. Those are two different situations. When Trump lies, it's about Google and Google changing votes and making you scared about things. When Joe Biden lies, it's about trying to say he's going to be commander-in-chief and he understands heroism. And I think context is super important, but it doesn't mean we ignore Joe Biden's gaffe.
Context and nuance, they're hallmarks of presidential campaign coverage.
Yeah.
Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and then click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.